Level check. Test 1, 2. Give it about 10 seconds. Let me figure that. Okay, that's it. Awesome. Okay, so you started the live stream?
All right. Can you hear me? Is it
I think
big?
we're good.
Yeah.
Okay, well now you've got my cell number. So
As long as they're not doing manual texting when you're on the job.
okay.
But you know how fast you should get. I mean, there's all kind of twists and turns to it, stuff like that.
So that means if you're gonna mention August, my guess is that you're not doing any of the commission stuff then, right?
Okay. What's that?
Are you doing any of the commission stuff, city commission?
Oh, with city council and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Or no. Oh, you mean here for the election coming up?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, because you said August, so like if you said March, I would have been like, okay, he's probably doing one in the districts or something.
Yeah. No, we got a yeah, Alachua, they just had their
We'll get everybody seated up front where there are some seats still. And we will pull out some more chairs, but we do have 5 chairs here on the front row on the left. Another chair here on the front row. We've got seats, just come forward. Okay. Welcome. I'm Gail Sasnet, Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and we are so glad that you are here tonight. And I know a lot of you are required to be here, but we're still glad because you are in for a treat. It's a real privilege for us to have here Tiana Epps-Johnson, who's going to be speaking. Tiana Epps-Johnson is the founder and executive director of the Center for Technology and Civic Life. She and her team provide resources and training to support local election administrators in modernizing the ways they communicate with voters. They also publish free open-source civic data sets that have been accessed over 200 million times through some of the most powerful tools that drive civic participation. Tiana holds an Master's of Science in Politics and Communication from the London School of Economics and a BA in Political Science from Stanford University. Additionally, Tiana was a Technology and Democracy Fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School for the 2015-16 academic year. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A. We will have a microphone set up here in the middle, and we will ask you to come to that microphone because we are streaming and recording this. At 7, we will end the public segment of this evening, so any members of the public will be excused, and then we'll let the Civic Scholar students have time for their more specific questions and more personal discussion with Tiana. I'll remind you to please turn off your cell phones, and now I'm going to turn the program over to Tiana.
Thank you all for coming out. Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Great. Gail, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to dive right in with sharing what I'm going to cover today with you all. I'm going to kick things off with just sharing an overview of the work that we do at the Center for Technology and Civic Life to sort of broadly orient you to what I'm up to as it relates to voting in elections. After that, I'm going to dig into 2 main challenges that voters experience when trying to access the polls, and talk about some of the specific work that we're doing with election officials to address those challenges. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we know about voters' information needs, some of the gaps in actually meeting those needs, and the ways that we're working to fix some of that. And then I'm going to talk about one of the enduring challenges that folks face, which is long lines at the polling places, and some of the ways that we're developing out tools and training to address those as well. But I'm going to kick things off with just sharing a little bit about myself. Again, I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for Technology and Civic Life. And when I was 19, while my friends were studying abroad in places like Santiago and Madrid and Paris, I went and did an abroad program in Washington, D.C., where I'm very cool, I was very cool back then too, where I was doing a full-time coursework and internship in a program there. And my internship was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in their Voting Rights Project. And while I was there, it was during the 2006 midterm election. And it was a really interesting time. I had a lot of different things that I expected through that internship and things that were sort of unanticipated that have led to some of the work that I'm doing today. So as an intern there, I was helping to field some of the questions that were coming through the 866 Our Vote Election Protection Hotline, this national hotline where people can call in and report any incidents that they're facing at the polls or ask questions, and generally folks who have either are paralegals or lawyers will help address those questions in advance of an election or on election day. And so as I was helping in advance of the 2006 election field some of the questions that voters were calling into the hotline with, I was expecting, there were some types of calls that I was expecting. The ones where folks were reporting misinformation about the election or deceptive practices, things like robocalls going out telling folks that we're expecting a huge turnout at the polls, and because of that, Republicans vote on Tuesday and Democrats vote on Wednesday. Those are the types of practices that I was expecting to hear through those calls. What I wasn't expecting were the number of calls that we were getting from voters across the country with really basic questions about how the process worked. Things like, how do I register to vote? Where do I go to register? Where do I actually need to show up at the polls? And I wasn't only surprised by the fact that those were a huge volume of the questions that we were getting, but I also was surprised as someone who was helping try to answer those for folks, how difficult it was to find answers to them. And so fast forward a little bit. In 2010, I had just finished up grad school. I went back to DC, had caught sort of the bug about how we might think about improving elections through that internship. And I joined a team that put together the first national free and open data set of answers to the question, where do I go to vote? So polling locations. And we made those available through a few tools, including a Google lookup tool. That program was done in partnership with Google, the nonprofit that I had been working on at the time called the New Organizing Institute, the Pugh Charitable Trust, and a few other partners. And in 2010, when we put this information out about voting locations, it was sort of this proof of concept. We were successful first in aggregating this data set. That was the first challenge that we didn't know if we were going to be able to meet. But once we were able to do that and get it out to the public, we were really surprised and happy to find that over 7 million people looked up where to vote using that tool in its first year. And it wasn't out weeks before the election. This is an effort that really brought us down to the wire. So a lot of people were looking up this information right in advance of it. There's a lot of popularity. And for us, that was a signal that we were really onto something about sort of the power of the internet to potentially connect people with really critical information about how to navigate the process. And also, we're onto something with a model where there was opportunities for folks in government and technology companies and nonprofits to collaborate to sort of solve for some of these challenges. So since then, I've spent the better part of the last decade working in partnership with government to think about the ways we can increase access to voting information, and also working with government to develop out tools that help them to better administer elections. And I founded the center in 2014 to take this work to the next level. So the Center for Technology and Civic Life is a nonprofit based in Chicago. I was excited to come here because I forgot what 70-degree weather felt like. And while we're based in Chicago, we have staff sort of all across the country. We have folks in Austin and Brooklyn, DC, and Pittsburgh, and was recently a new hire in Wyoming. And our work focuses on how we might use technology to improve how local government and communities interact, with an emphasis on modernizing the local election process and how local elections are administered. Our organization's work falls into two main buckets. The first we call government services, and the second we call civic data. Our government services team provides professional development training to election officials. We focus on training that helps election officials build data, digital, and design skills to improve how they're engaging their communities. Concretely, that looks like a few things, things like how election offices might use social media for voter engagement to meet the needs of people who are looking for information online, or how we might use data to make resource allocation decisions so we don't see things like hours-long lines at the polls. So I'll spend most of this talk touching on some of the work that our government services team does. But I want to make sure to also mention some of the work that our civic data team does. So if you're not an election administrator, which I'm guessing, I only think that there's maybe one person who's an election official in the room, you're much more likely to have come in contact with our civic data work. Our civic data team works directly with civic engagement organizations and technology companies to make it really easy to find answers to sort of basic questions about how the election process works in the places that people already are. We focus on answering 3 main questions. What's on my ballot? Who are my elected officials? And how can I learn more about either of those groups of people? You may have interacted with our data in 2016 if you looked up anything about what was on your ballot through Google search. Our ballot data powers that tool. You also may have interacted with our data in 2016 if you have a Facebook account. Every US user got a notification at the top of their news feed to make a vote plan. And if you click through that, the tool would also let you look up the folks that were on your ballot all the way from federal offices down to hyper-local people, learn more about the folks on your ballot, and then if you wanted to, you could print that out and take it with you to the ballot box so that you were prepared in advance of the election. Through these tools, if you sort of remember when I mentioned before the first time we worked on polling places, we saw about 7 million people access this data in 2010. We've seen exponential growth in how many folks are using the data that we provide. In 2016, we saw over 150 million interactions with this data. On Facebook, we had over 10 million unique users look up what was on their ballot. So there's clearly an appetite for this information online. But we don't only partner with major technology companies. One example of that, you may have interacted with our data if you were one of over 30,000 high school students in North Carolina who participated in a very realistic election simulation where 5th graders, I think, served as poll workers. And our data helped power the ballots that folks voted on in their schools. And this was a really fun partnership with a nonprofit called First Vote North Carolina, who, among other things, is really focused on creating civic habits early. All told, in 2016, just for a sense of scale with our civic data work, some surveying estimates that we reached between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone who cast a ballot in 2016. So as a nonprofit that only has 8 full-time staff, we're pretty proud of that number, and really the power, our impact is it really depends on our partnerships, and so we really focus on building out strong relationships with folks across the country to make sure that we are getting information in the hands of people where they're looking for it. So with that overview of the work that I'm doing, I'm now going to transition to one of the first voter access challenges that we focus on as an organization, and that's connecting public with the information that you need to navigate the voting process. So these are some of my favorite selfies. In advance of elections, we are saturated with information about campaigns, but we often only hear about local election officials if there are really long lines at the polling place or if something else goes wrong. But election officials, folks like the supervisor of elections here in Florida, have not only a critical but a unique role in being responsible for maintaining and publishing accurate and unbiased information about how the voting process works. And while we've seen a really growing use of big data and deeper benches of tech talent going to campaigns, we've seen local government being sort of left behind in that trend. For some context, about 90% of election jurisdictions are in medium to small communities with, on average, only 2 to 4 staff. If you're a staff of that size, you are essentially splitting duties that range from buying voting technology to allocating resources at polling places, recruiting and training poll workers, and doing all of those functions of informing the public. It's really an impressive and frankly exhausting list of responsibilities to be split among 2 to 4 people. And while technology has become more and more critical to how us as public expect to consume information, there's almost never a dedicated technical staff person in these election offices. And there are very few, if any, professional development opportunities for election officials to be able to build these tech skills in-house. These challenges are in large part why we founded the center, so that we can help election officials build the skills that they need to be confident in using technology to run modern elections. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our process to the work. Throughout our work, we take best practices, user testing, public polling and research, and on-the-ground conversations and observation of the work of election officials to develop technology and curriculum. So I'm going to start by talking about what user research tells us about the types of information voters are looking for. And by tell you, I'm going to actually start by making you all do some work. This is going to be interactive. Sorry for not giving you warning. So I want you to turn to the folks next to you and discuss these 3 questions. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do this. What do you think are voters' top 5 questions in advance of an election? What do you think are those in order of importance to voters? And what do you think is the one unique question that non-voters or folks who've never voted before have? So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to discuss that with the folks next to you. And then I'll open it back up to hear what your thoughts are.
That's true. Or if it was like, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Or if it's like where to go to, is there as far as like yeah, because there has to be like some reason why they don't, whether it's like technical or it's just like
I'm going to give you guys about 30 more seconds and then hear what you guys think.
like a little bit, not too much.
All right. Someone let me know what your group came up with as what you think is the number 1 question that voters have. Don't be shy. Back there. Where's the polling place? Did someone have something different than where do I go to vote? Yes.
Where to register to vote?
Where to register to vote? Something different than that is the number 1 question? When is the election? Anything different than those 3 is the number 1 question? This is a fun breakout I like to do, not only with groups like this, but also with election officials. I am pretty confident that no one's ever gotten the number 1 question right. So sort of, I'm going to reveal what these answers are. But I think one of the things that this points to is really the importance of user research and how we approach our work. A lot of the assumptions that we have about how other people might interact with the process or the types of questions that people have, we have to be really rigorous about testing. So the number 1 question that people have is, what's on my ballot? This makes sense because people want to know what's at stake. Is it even worthwhile to participate in this process at all? We know that in 2010 and 2012, not only do people want the answer to this question, but about 65% of people looked online for the answer to this. The second question that is most important to voters is, what are my options for where and how to vote? So this covers a few different things. Things like, can I vote early? Can I vote by mail? And then where do I actually go for these things? The third is one that I heard. When is the next election or other key dates? So, what is this? When is this primary or the general election? What are the registration deadlines? Is there a last day to request a mail ballot? Those other sort of process points. The next is one that almost never comes up. How do I contact my election official? So essentially, where do I go for more answers to the questions that I might have directly from the source? And then the fifth, this is one that especially election officials don't guess, but it's what happens at the polling place. When I actually get there, what should I expect? And then the one unique question that non-voters have, voters, non-voters want to know what's on the ballot, but they have a unique question too. And it's a really broad one, just how do I become involved? The whole process is new, so it's a question that's a little bit more nebulous than some of the other ones, but folks want to know just like, where do I even start? And so now that we have a shared understanding of the types of information that folks are looking for, broadly speaking, I want to drill down a little bit deeper. So not only do people look online for election information, and believe me, I've been doing this work just long enough where I used to have to prove the point that people are looking online for information in general and not just for elections. But not only are people looking online for information, but because voting is a very local thing, people prefer local websites to state websites to find this information. This means that local election officials have an important obligation to provide complete and helpful voting information to the public. They're more important than the local newspaper in this regard. They're more important than the Secretaries of State's or State Board of Elections website in this regard. More than 3 times the number of voters who looked online for election information first looked at a local election website rather than a state election website. So with all that in mind, this next stat might be surprising to learn. Research done in 2013 and that we replicated again in 2015, done by first the Center for Civic Design, found that about 960 counties, or a third of the counties in the US, have no website with any type of election information on it at all. I see some wide eyes, so I will say that the vast majority of the population are covered by jurisdictions that have a website, but there are still these huge information gaps. This number is striking, but it becomes even more problematic when we take into account that local election offices are often the only source for some really critical voting information. This is an image of how my work would be a lot easier if boundaries for elections look like this. But because of federalism and local control, there are functions that counties, cities, and municipalities, and even more specialized local districts are exclusively responsible for. So if you're a voter in a locality without a website, or with a poor site with limited information, or you're not regularly picking up your local newspaper, you may be out of luck when you're looking to find out information about local candidates on your ballot or when the next election is, if it doesn't coincide with a statewide or federal election. And this is because literally the only place that holds this information is your local election office. Campaigns and civic engagement groups also play an important information role, but given their limited resources, well-run campaigns focus on targeting a specific segment of voters with information, the folks that they want to turn out. And so they have a different role than election officials who are sort of obligated to serve their whole community. And so these challenges feel a little bit even more acute if you're someone like me who's desperately passionate about increasing civic engagement. And what this means for our civic data work is that when we're working to organize the nation's ballot data, we're making lots of phone calls, and we are collecting faxes, and we're receiving physical mail of information to be able to make the data sets that power the tools like the Google and Facebook tools. So yes, these are millennials in the wild collecting physical mail and faxes. So I want to transition to something a little more optimistic, the work that we're doing to close these gaps. In 2013, I was on the road with one of my co-founders riding around in a Dr. Pepper colored minivan. And that year, we were aiming to meet with election officials to learn more about their work. We met with hundreds of local election officials in their offices and at conferences. We knew a lot about what research told us. And my co-founder was an election official for 5 years prior to joining my team. So she brought knowledge to the table as well. But we wanted to hear directly from these election officials about how we might bring our technical expertise to bear on the challenges that they were facing. And through these conversations, we decided that the first thing that we were going to tackle was this website gap. Both by getting election offices online for the first time, so closing that 966 number, as well as helping to improve the content that was on the websites that already existed. So in this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what user research tells us about what voters are looking for on websites and how. And I'm also going to talk about how we took all of that information and translated it into an actual product for election officials. So on this slide, it's one of my opportunities to plug one of my favorite organizations that we partner closely with called the Center for Civic Design, civicdesign.org. If you've never heard of them, their work is really important, and it's some of my favorite. The Center for Civic Design is the organization that we partner most with to understand the information needs and other needs of non-voters, voters, avid voters, to think about how we're developing out products. So they came up with these brilliant field guides. There's now 11 of them that tackle a range of different types of challenges that election officials might be facing. They're really beautifully designed and have about 10 steps in each of them that share best practices that are really practical. And so one of my favorite ones is Field Guide number 7, Designing an Election Department Website. And this field guide has tips on everything from the type of content that should be there, like answering the question of what's on my ballot in a place where it's easy to find, to the types of other government sites that you should link to the ways that you should be thinking about the actual design of the site itself. So here is the website template that we developed taking that field guide and turning it into an actual product itself. I'm going to walk through a few features of this site, but a little bit of context. One of the things that was really important to us was not only having a site that met the information needs of voters, but also was something that election officials themselves could regularly update and maintain. This is because if we go back to sort of thinking about the fact that there's not a dedicated tech person in an office, there might be a county IT person, but the county IT person is probably going to have a little bit less urgency of making sure that the election website is perfectly updated all of the time. So a process in a system where there's sort of a county IT person or a vendor usually looks like if an election official needs to make an update, they have to send an email to ask for that update, wait until someone takes the time to actually do that. And so we often find that even if you have a website, the information can be really outdated. So we wanted to make sure that it was really easy to maintain by the election official themselves, regardless of their tech expertise. So the back end of this looks a lot like a Google Doc. On the front end, one of the first things that you might notice is that there's a lot, this is very simple, there's a lot of white space. And that is all really deliberate. One of the important practices that we're doing here as it relates to plain design is having the most important information in the center of the page. Studies show that more than 40% of US adults have low literacy. People with low literacy read straight down the middle of the page and will totally miss content that's on the left and the right. So a really important thing to make sure that information is accessible to everyone is thinking about how you only make the content that is important visible right where folks are going to be looking for it. We also make sure that baked into this template, it's really clear the different options that folks have to vote, and that we're answering that one critical question: how does the process actually work, whether it's the vote by mail process or voting in person? So we're demystifying it for folks that haven't engaged in the first place or might be new to a jurisdiction. So this is what one of the content pages looks like. Another thing that we train on when folks are using our website template, or when we're doing trainings on election website best practices, is a practice called writing in plain language. Making sure that all of the content that we have on the pages are free of jargon and acronyms that only people who work in elections know. It also is a practice where you take information and you put it in numbered lists if it's sequential steps, or you use bulleted lists so that we don't have extra verbiage that's not really useful to the voter. So this website template is now being used in over a dozen election offices across the country, from Maryland to Ohio to Kansas to California. And we also regularly do trainings for how, even without using the template, offices can integrate these best practices into their existing websites. We're doing a series of online trainings over the next 4 weeks starting next week. So with that, I'm going to transition to talking about wait times. Hopefully, this image is only familiar to you all from reading newspapers and not an experience that any of you all have actually had. But it's not news to this group that an enduring barrier to the ballot box is long lines at polling places. This has been a decades-long problem. And in 2013, then President Barack Obama said the following during the State of the Union: when any Americans, no matter where they live or what their party, are denied the right simply because we can't wait for 5, 6, 7 hours just to cast their ballot, we're betraying our ideals. We can fix this, and we will. The American people demand it, and so does our democracy. So following that, it wasn't just like a lofty thing. President Obama then created the Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2013, chaired by Ben Ginsburg, who was counsel to the RNC and Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, and by Bob Bauer, who was the former White House counsel under Barack Obama. So a very bipartisan effort. So it had several commissioners who worked in local elections or other industry that might have some knowledge to bring to bear to some of the challenges that we were facing as voters. The Presidential Commission on Election Administration, the PCEA, released a beautiful report with guidance in many areas, including a target that no voter should wait longer than 30 minutes to vote. Managing lines at polling places is a complex challenge because there's so many things that go into line management. The number of people who show up. If there's more turnout than you've seen in past elections of a similar type, that can totally throw off what you expect to see at the polling place. The number of staff in a polling location, the number of machines. If the equipment doesn't work properly, that can cause massive long lines. The competence of poll workers can influence lines. So one of the recommendations from the PCA was that election officials should use available tools to make resource allocation decisions. In particular, they pointed to 3 tools that had been developed for the use of helping to make optimize the length of lines. One of the tools, the one that's called the line optimization tool on this particular screen, was something that our team was particularly impressed by. It's a tool developed by a developer called Mark Polzarski. And we really liked it because it's both pretty easy to use and quite powerful. So the way that it works is that you enter a few different data points, things like the number of expected voters at a polling place, the number of check-in stations that you have at the polling place, the number of voting stations, the hours when polls are open, the average number of minutes that it would take to, you think on average, to check in a voter, and the average of number of minutes that a voter is going to spend with a ballot. So you take all of these different data points, you input them for each of the precincts or each of your polling places. And then it runs a simulation of what to expect in terms of wait times over the course of the day and when. So you can see based on this simulation that it takes into account sort of the places where we would expect to see peaks, people coming to vote before they head to work, and then again after the workday is over. And so the next few slides, I'm going to show you what happens as we look at different scenarios. If we increase, we can see what happens if we add 100 more people. So 100 more people show up than we expected. See how that affects our wait times. Here we can see what happens if we have a particularly slow check-in clerk. So we increase the check-in time by a minute. Okay, now we're seeing some problems. We can see here what happens if we have too few voting stations. If we have too fewer, then we see some real line challenges, especially at the end of the day. So this tool is really powerful. It gives you an opportunity to see, do lots of different types of contingency planning and make good decisions about how you are staffing and equipping a polling place. And so that all was great, but we found through our conversations with election officials that they didn't know this tool existed. And if they did, they didn't know how to use it. So we decided that we would work on that. So we first reached out to Mark Pelzarski, the developer of the tool, and we had him host a webinar that we facilitated with election officials in our network to explain how to use the tool and what to expect. And they also gave feedback on different features that they wished were there. So there's actually more data points that you can input now than you could when it was first developed. And then we added it to the election toolkit, which is one of the sites that we maintain for election officials, electiontools.org. And the resource allocation tool became one of the tools that we evangelize for when we're out in the field with election officials. And on electiontools.org, this site, for every tool that we feature, we include step-by-step guides on how you actually make it work. Because, again, we want to make sure that someone's tech expertise is not something that impedes them from being able to use tools to effectively run elections. And so we found that not only are election officials increasingly use this tool to make decisions about how they're staffing and equipping polling places, but they're also using it to make the case that they need more resources to decision makers. So if we sort of look at those slides that I went through, if you are at in a budget meeting and someone is saying, actually, no, you don't need that funding for paying more poll workers or additional voting equipment, it's a pretty compelling case that you can make about what to expect if you don't get those resources. And so we've been excited to see election officials using the tools in that manner as well. And we also started working on the piece of making sure that election officials have reliable data to put in these tools to make these predictions in the first place, because this simulation is only as good as the data that you put into it. If you think, just based on your intuition, that on average it takes a minute to check in each voter, but actually it takes 2.5 minutes, we saw what a different experience that means in terms of wait times. So we've been developing, still with Mark Pelzarski, a set of additional tools to sort of complement what we now call the Polling Place Resource Planner. So we've included an app to just collect data on wait times at the polling place. Some election officials use this app solely as an internal tool to understand places where lines and wait times were short versus long, and use that data then to make decisions for the next election. We've had other counties like Arapahoe County in Colorado actually build a voter-facing front end on top of this so that folks can see in real time where there are heavy wait times. That works particularly in that county because you can vote at a vote center, so you don't have to choose just the polling place that you're assigned at. We also created an app that allows you to measure really easily how long someone's spending with the ballot, so that you can help to understand if that time, if the length of a ballot is something that's actually influencing whether we're seeing long lines. And we're now in the process of developing a fourth app in this sort of suite of apps that would let someone say, all right, for this election we have a ballot that's going to have 2 contested races and 1 uncontested race and 3 referenda. On average, how long would we expect a voter to wait to spend trying to vote this ballot? So just continuing to think about the ways we can simplify the data collection process and raise awareness about these tools that are available. So this work that is efforts of election officials and technologists and academics and folks inside and outside of government, there's some progress that's happening. Charles Stewart at MIT found that in 2016 wait times were shorter than in 2012. Shout out to Florida, who had the biggest improvement in average time waiting to vote, went from 45 minutes to less than 10 minutes. This is not all a rosy picture. There are still sort of enduring disparities between the folks who are more likely to wait in lines than others. Black voters are much more likely to encounter lines that are longer than 30 minutes than white voters, for example. And in 2016, we still saw more than 10% of voters waiting longer than 30 minutes in roughly half the states. So there's still work to do, but we are seeing progress. So with that, I'm going to pause here for questions. But before I do that, I just want to take one moment of speaker privilege and say that this has been a really special day to be with you, but it's been a particularly special day for me because, at the risk of becoming a blubbering mess, my grandma came to see my talk. This is the first time that I think any of my family has seen me do work in person. My grandma is an amazing person for lots of reasons, not just because she's my grandma. Among other things, she graduated high school the year before schools were desegregated in Little Rock, Arkansas, and among other things went on to get her PhD in organic chemistry while raising 5 kids with her husband overseas fighting in a war. She is the matriarch of our family, and I think I can say on behalf of all of her grandchildren and children that we do our work in hopes to just be worthy of being part of her legacy. So I'm really happy to have her here join us today. So with that, I will take your questions.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. My name is Jamie Roy. I'm one of the civic scholars here. So my question for you was about that 1 in 3 statistic about having websites with no information. You said correct?
No website at all.
Yeah, no website at all. So I was interested how the demographics broke down, and just roughly if you guys did that sort of analytics, if they were rural or minority.
Yeah, so they're overwhelmingly rural jurisdictions. About 94% of the population is covered by a jurisdiction that has at least some web presence. So those 960 plus counties are primarily quite rural jurisdictions. Yeah, so I think that that's sort of the main point about the 1 in 3. What I would add to that is that just because there's an election website that exists, that's like a sort of binary 0-1. Was there a website or not? It wasn't looking at the actual quality of the information that was there. When you dig deeper into what actually exists on these websites, how well designed they are, sort of the ability to say that people have a election website that actually serves them, we'd probably see even bigger disparities, far fewer that are actually serving the needs of voters.
Hi, my name is Yael Diamond, and I'm also a civic scholar here. I have a question about something you didn't mention.
Okay.
I remember when I was 16, I pre-registered to vote with the Motor Voter Act when I got my driver's license here in the state of Florida. And I was wondering if that was something you were also looking into to engage people young, get them interested in voting, and then have them pre-registered so when they do turn 18, they don't have to do anything.
Yeah, so we don't work directly on voter registration, but I have a few different thoughts on that. One of the things that we try to lift up were a few programs that we've seen across the country where election officials are doing a really great job of engaging young people in the process and creating civic habits early. So one of the ways that that manifests in our work is lifting up places that run really excellent programs to get young people to serve as poll workers. So in my home city of Chicago, there is this really cool partnership with this organization called the MICBA Challenge, where the MICBA does civic learning in high schools, and they partner with the Chicago Board of Elections to provide over 3,000 young poll workers inside polling places. And young poll workers not only get to learn more about sort of the nitty-gritty of how the election process works, but also bring a lot of really amazing skills to bear, usually the language that their neighbors also speak, tech skills that older poll workers might not have, the ability to lift equipment. So we will take something like the MICBA Challenge that's working really well in Chicago and tell the story of that to election officials in other parts of the country so they might think about the types of programs that they can run to better engage young voters. I think another program that we lift up is one that was happening out in Maryland where even younger folks have been engaged in the election process. And not only did we see that that was creating habits for the young folks, but also they were encouraging their parents to participate in the process. So, it's not just about parents or setting good examples for younger people, but these young folks were making sure that their parents were showing up to vote. So again, not working specifically on voter registration, but are thinking about some of the models where we're seeing jurisdictions do really great work at engaging young people and lifting those up so other people can adopt those practices.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, my name is Laura. First, thank you, because I think this has been one of the coolest talks I've heard at the Bob Graham Center, so this is really, really cool.
Thank you.
So a little bit of background. I know that using state voter files, we're able to see what populations vote which way. So vote by mail, early vote, and I guess we're kind of able to make assumptions on which populations use those different forms of accessibility to their advantage. My question's about the calls that you got. So were you able to collect maybe demographic or spatial data based on those types of people, and if that data was able to be used to better design the outreach strategies that you guys have for those types of populations?
So those calls that I got were in 2006. So that's 12 years ago. So, I can tell you what where that data went. So after the election, I spent part of my internship was also spending time writing a sort of big report on the incidents that we saw across the country and identifying the different types of problems that we saw and the patterns that we saw both within states and across the country. And then that data is then used by a place like the Lawyers Committee to make decisions about places where they will do more focused work, where they'll have more people on the ground. And they have done more and more over the last decade to digitize how that data collection happens in the first place so that they're able to, within their coalition, make those types of decisions based on the information that they're getting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. Wanted to thank you for the talk, first of all, because it was really insightful. I had a question related to, throughout your time working in this field and analyzing elections around the country, have you ever found or ever experienced any areas that have experienced, deliberate attacks on making it so that people cannot vote in certain ways, and has that affected either wait times or other kinds of problems? And what have you done, if you have experienced those, to prevent those from happening?
Yeah, so we don't do, I think election protection folks do sort of more of that targeted reaction to any deliberate efforts to prevent people from casting their ballot. So we do less of that sort of reactionary work. What I will say sort of on behalf of election officials is that oftentimes sort of the more partisan decisions about access to the ballot, those things are being fought a lot of the time in legislatures rather than by the folks that are working to implement an election well. So, by and large, in my experience, election officials in general are really committed to running great elections, less interested in sort of doing deliberate things to create barriers. And I think that that's an interesting nuance that I've learned through my work with election officials.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi,
my name is Susanna. I wanted to ask you if there's ever been any analysis done on outside factors such as transportation or traffic, parking, availability that can impede people from voting?
Yes. And one of the really big challenges for us as an organization, the way that this touches us, it's really hard for us to create a direct connection between the work that we do and something like turnout, because there are so many other factors that influence whether or not someone is going to turn out to vote. Some of the things that you mentioned, maybe on that list, one of them is weather. If it is gorgeous here in Florida, folks are going to probably be more likely to turn out to vote than in places like where there is 0-degree weather in Chicago right now if we had an election at the same time. So little things like that that you just can't control at all will affect whether or not people turn out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hello.
Good evening. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation. My name is Linnea. I'm also a Grand Civic Scholar this year. I was wondering, it's very noble to believe that everyone wants to vote, but what's the psychology? Have you done any research into non-voters and why they don't want to go to the polls?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm actually really interested in exploring this year is diving deeper into the sort of social psychology of why people choose to show up or not. It's an area where I want to do more learning myself. One of the ways that we're thinking about those questions and connecting election officials with those answers is we're just rolling out our first course on motivational messaging for how you communicate with folks to encourage them to show up to vote. And there are also some really interesting organizations who focus specifically on the social psychology of voting. One of them is a group called Ideas 42. One of the things that they've found that probably will resonate with you that's a barrier to voting is that it feels like a test, and it feels like a test that you can fail. And that's not a really great system if it feels that way. And so, as folks that are doing engagement work, we have to think about how we understand the types of things that would demotivate voters to show up at the polls. One of the really cool programs that has been happening across the country that's had really impressive impact on getting more people to cast a ballot are these parties at the polls. So nonpartisan parties that happen at polling places where they invite folks across the community. They're not only knocking on doors of registered voters to invite people, not only like people that are of voting age, anyone can come. They have like photo booths and other things and just make Election Day a celebratory experience. And it's been shocking. It's something just like bringing joy to voting that has had a really outsized, they've done randomized controlled experiments to be able to test the impact, and it has been really, really impressive. So I'm excited to see that model gain a little bit more steam. Hello.
And again, thanks for the talk. I feel like I'm the fifth person to say that, but if I don't, I'm just the worst person. But so you mentioned blacks waiting in longer lines. I think it was 30 minutes longer even.
It wasn't. I didn't give a specific number, but
oh, okay. Gotcha.
On average, more.
It's been a day. Well, I'm just tired then.
I may have said that.
Yeah. So what are the reasons for this? Because obviously with turnout specifically, understandably voter suppression laws, things like that could come into play. But what are the reasons for the longer wait lines? Is it purely a funding thing to fund these polling locations that are typically attended by African Americans, or what is the reasons for this?
Yeah, I think that one of the easy observations to make is that you're more likely to find long wait times in a highly urban area where there's more people to turn out in the first place. And so to the extent that folks of color are more likely to live in urban areas, then they're more likely to, even if controlling for all of those other things, experience long lines. But I think that there are sort of the specific reasons why communities of color are more likely to experience long lines. Really, I think, depends on the election jurisdiction. But certainly one of them is them being in sort of places where there's going to be a lot more turnout.
Okay, so and just one follow-up question. So how would you taper that and deal with that issue then?
Yeah, I think making sure that election officials have the resources that they need to be able to know that in the past we've seen 4 hours long lines. We have to have the funding and resources to open, and the political will to open more polling places and staff them properly and train poll workers properly so that we don't see these problems persist.
Hi, thanks for the talk. In what ways do you see the nonprofit area helping with these funding issues? Because a lot of time the funding comes from the government, but the government only has so much funding that they can provide. And with the information gap and all the other problems, like how can nonprofits or how can the community help?
Yeah, so, in an ideal world, for this particular problem, local election offices would have all the funding that they need to do the work that a lot of us as nonprofits are helping to make happen. But because they're often woefully under-resourced, it creates an opportunity for organizations like mine to exist, to be able to bring resources to bear on these problems. And so I would say that the biggest opportunity is just that there are so many complex challenges and there are not enough resources to solve them at this point, even if we all, everyone in this room right now decided immediately to work on them, because there's still funding constraints for us as nonprofits, funding constraints for folks in academia, funding constraints for government offices, and often funding constraints because some of the work that we're doing is kind of unsexy. I used to have a pitch deck that I titled Bringing Unsexy Back, because I'm talking about, trying to fund this infrastructure work for how elections work, which is a little bit less cool than shiny apps that might be pitched by folks that are out in Silicon Valley. So I think also just people really understanding some of the core root causes of the challenges that we're seeing in elections better, and being more willing to provide resources to solve those root causes rather than things that are more shiny or exciting.
Hi, second question for you. So for that, the line optimization tool, I was curious whether or not you all had used it even on early voting days, and if what data you had gathered on that, if you had.
So that's a good question. I don't know, I couldn't name specific election offices that are using it for early voting, but the data that's used to be able to sort of power that simulation, the data that lets you sort of underpins it so you can put in these different data points and run that simulation, came out of a ton of election observation in different contexts out of the political space actually first, and then we then adapted it for a tool for election officials. So I don't know that I can give you a direct answer to your question.
Okay, in that case, is the information that's gathered with this, is that all available through your center, for public access?
So the ways, all these tools are free and open for people to use. We do some, so a couple of the tools do aggregate data to a centralized place that is available for research. So some of the tools on collecting how long someone waits for a ballot, for example, election offices can opt into making that data go to a centralized place for analysis. But often these are we want to take them and give them away so people can use them however they like in their election office without sort of requiring that they give anything back to us using these tools.
Thank you so much.
It looks like we have 1 minute left.
Right at 7 o'clock. So if there are any public members who want to leave, I want to excuse you. You don't have to. You're welcome to stay. And students, this is more of your time now.
Am I allowed to sit down? Thank you. Thank you.